However, got on very well with Hamlin, to his credit. And Nicolas Baudin was a perfectionist, in a way like Flinders, and he took he would accept no rubbish from anyone, and particularly from his crew. So they weren't endeared to him in any way at all, whereas Flinders' crew were. What didn't help Baudin was apparently he didn't take on enough wine at Madeira or at Mauritius, and for French people that's a serious disappointment. We don't know whether he was married or had children, probably not. There's no record of his personal life, but the most intriguing little thing about him, I find, is that, as we'll see in a few months' time, he's been in Sydney as a guest of Governor King, and he asked the governor, would it be okay to take on a 17-year-old English girl, convict, with him back to Europe? And Governor King agreed to this. Her name was Mary Beckwith, and she'd come out as a convict with her mother, and the mother worked as the mistress or housekeeper for one of the senior officers in Sydney, who was a Francophile like Governor King. And so Nicolas Baudin would go to that home. So he must have met this young girl. How they came to Sydney is an extraordinary story in itself, and of course I haven't got time now, but I find it amazing that she was 15. She was accused of stealing 70 yards of muslin cloth from a haberdashery in Regent Street in London, and she apparently secreted it underneath her dress. 70 metres is a lot of cloth, so what the true story is about that, who knows? Okay, next slide is Captain Hamlin. He was older, very distinguished. He went on he had a distinguished naval career even after the Baudin expedition, and he seemed to get on well with his crew. Also on board was, next slide please, Louis Frassanet and his brother Henri. There are two Frassanets, and so Frassanet Peninsula in Tasmania is named after his brother, but Louis Frassanet really became more famous because, as we'll see, he got his own little ship at the end of the expedition, and he came back to Australia many years later, and of course he took away Blooming's plate back to Paris. Also on board was Francois Perron, a naturalist, very ambitious, great friends with Louis Frassanet, and the two of them hated Baudin. And so when, at the end of this story, Baudin, the journal of the expedition is actually written by Perron, and all the charts basically are completed by Louis Frassanet, who was a very talented cartographer. Also on board was an artist, Lejeune, who produced the most extraordinary drawings of early Australia, such as, next slide, Francois Perron, and the next slide is Lejeune from 1818, and then the next slide is just an example of his artwork of a jellyfish. Next slide, please. So, a very complicated map, which indicates that the Baudin expedition spent 2 years in this country, in New Holland, between May 1801 and July 1803. They spent, of those 2 years, 18 months at sea exploring the coastline. However, 5 months were spent at Port Jackson, hence the bay, Neutral Bay in Sydney, where they anchored. They made 2 visits to Timor, and yet, after all this time, unfortunately for Baudin, he only contributed 2 teeny-weeny little bits to the map of Australia. Next slide. And so, as you can see, thanks to Ruth, so what happened was they met here. This is Encounter Bay in 1802, 8th of April, when Flinders met Baudin. So what had Baudin done? He'd first come across from Cape Town, or Mauritius, actually, from Mauritius, and he hit Cape Leeuwin. So this was the beginning of his voyage, and he did significant exploration of Geograph Bay, which is this little bay here. This is Margaret River, Cape Leeuwin. So Cape Naturalist is here, Geograph Bay is here. So the 2 ships are named forever on our map in that way. They also did significant exploration up here. They had an important encounter with the Aborigines in Geograph Bay, but no bloodshed, fortunately. In fact, the most extraordinary feature of Baudin's voyage is that there was no bloodshed. In all that time, with many encounters, and they had a great time, even with the women of Tasmania, there was no violence on the part, no injuries on the part of the local Australians. One Frenchman did get speared, but he survived, and he got speared because he had wrestled with a local Australian as a game and beaten him, and that was not kosher, of course. So they went up from here then, took off the coast, came into Shark Bay, did more further cartography. Louis Frassanet did marvellous maps of Shark Bay, and the only encounter that I've come across in this whole story of 200 years, you know, they saw lots of sharks and alligators, as they called them, and sea snakes. And you know how dangerous Australia is with all our critters. Not a single explorer in all the records that I've read suffered any injury at the hands of any of those critters, except one Frenchman in waist-high deep water in Shark Bay catching a turtle, and he sees this huge shark come towards him. So what does he do? He plucks its eyes out of the shark. So I think that's good advice for any of us. And so from Shark Bay they went up to Timor. The ships did get separated at one point. They went up to Timor and then decided, we better come back to Australia. And so they made their way down to Tasmania and had a nice stay there. Next slide, please. So these are just some images of, I'm sorry about the shadow on the slide, Cape Naturalist at the top of Margaret River region there. Geograph Bay, thank you. Frassanet's map of Geograph Bay, keep going, thank you. And there's Australia, so Tasmania. So they came down into Bruny Island at the bottom here and spent about 2 months having a great time, taught the first Australians French, and no violence except for payback to one of the French crew that I mentioned. Okay, some beautiful images by another artist. That next slide, thank you. This is a very famous portrait of a particular first Australian on Bruny Island by Pettit. Carry on then, next slide please. D'Entrecasteaux Channel, of course, was named after an earlier French explorer who'd been there. Next slide, and Frassanet Peninsula in Tasmania, named after Henri Frassanet. Next slide. So, what happens after Tasmania is the ships get separated in a storm. Hamlin goes on to Sydney, Port Jackson, and Baudin says, okay, it's now time to get to this unknown southern coast. I haven't got there yet. So he goes up, across Bass Strait, and picks up really where near Port Phillip Bay, but doesn't go in there, and then travels along the Victorian coastline there until he hits Encounter Bay with Flinders. Okay, next slide. So here we're at Encounter Bay. What happened at Encounter Bay is recorded in both the journals of Baudin and Flinders, and it's an amicable meeting. They have a meeting at dusk. So Flinders goes across to Baudin's ship, presents his credentials. He takes with him Robert Brown, the naturalist, who speaks fluent French. And so they apparently, the three of them with Baudin, sit in his cabin and try to have a conversation. Baudin's English is appalling, according to Robert Brown. But Flinders explains his purpose and Baudin explains his purpose, and they share information about the southern coastline that they've just done. They didn't exchange maps, of course, because they were not crafted properly. But Baudin knew absolutely that Flinders had charted this unknown southern coast from Newt's Archipelago, halfway around the Great Australian